The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. My name is Henry Cohn. I am a past president of the 92nd Street Y and currently a board member. It's my distinct pleasure and honor this evening to introduce someone who is truly a Renaissance man for our time. After his talk, there will be a question and answer period here, followed by a book signing in the adjacent art gallery. Mr. Buckley really needs no introduction. He's a prolific author. He's also an editor, a novelist, a playwright, sought-after lecturer, and well-known host of Firing Line. In 1955, he founded the National Review and is its present president. He's the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And as you know, as the host of Firing Line, his guests have included nearly every major figure in contemporary politics and cultural life in America and abroad. Among his many books are On the Firing Line, The Public Life of Our Public Figures, Gratitude, Reflections on What We Owe to Our Country, Windfall, and of course, the topic of his talk this evening, In Search of Anti-Semitism. An independent and brilliant thinker, he's respected on all ends of the political spectrum for his ideas, which always inform, enlighten, and challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, William F. Buckley Jr.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Cohn. I'm happy to be here once again, even though I'm a little bit intimidated, having heard that the greatest harpsichordist in the world, Gerald Rank, would be here tonight. But let me get on with it. Two years ago, I undertook an exploration. It began as an essay and ended as a book. I welcome the opportunity to chronicle that exploration and to advance my thinking on the subject still further, and I hope yours. I subtitled my essay on anti-Semitism, What Do Some Christians Do That Annoys Some Jews, and Vice Versa. I have some credentials, if that is the right word for it, in the area, among them my own father's anti-Semitism. My father and his generation lived in an age in which anti-Semitism was, of course, widespread. I suppose there's no harm in revealing that it was Mac George Bundy, former dean of Harvard, former national security advisor to Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, former president of the Ford Foundation, who told me one day at lunch, apropos I forget what, that if he were to hear spoken today the kind of thing that was, quotes, routinely spoken at my father's lunch table, he would leave the room in protest. I knew exactly what he meant because at my father's lunch table one heard, I must suppose, the same kind of thing. Interestingly enough, the bias never engaged the enthusiastic attention of any of my father's 10 children, any more than of Mr. Bundy's 4, if you don't count one night at what was taken for revelry. 7 or 8 children in Sharon, Connecticut, among them 4 of my brothers and sisters, thought it would be a great lark to burn a cross outside a Jewish resort nearby. That story has been told in my biographer, John Dudas. I pointed out that I was not among that wretched little band. He failed to point out that I wept tears of frustration at having been forbidden by senior siblings to go out on that adventure on the grounds that at age 11 I was considered too young. Suffice it to say that here were children, some of them as old as 15 or 16, who wouldn't themselves threaten anyone, light-heartedly doing in 1937 that kind of thing, thoughtless, yes, but motivated exclusively by the desire to have the fun of scaring adults. It was the kind of thing we didn't distinguish from a Halloween prank. None of us gave any thought to Kristallnacht when a year later it happened, November 9, 1938. I was 12 in a boarding school in England, and certainly none of us thought through to its implications. On the other hand, neither did the State Department. Those were the years when Daniel Bell's cousin Theodore Cohen, freshly graduated from CCNY, decided to go to Japan to become a sinologist. Why? Because, I was told, there was no way in which he could achieve a tenured chair at Columbia, his burning ambition as a mere social scientist. Quotes, they just didn't give professorships to Jews. It was explained to me. The professor who taught me philosophy was the first Jew to be given tenure at Yale. Newsweek magazine recently made an academic note that illustrates how far removed we are from those pre-war days. Newsweek wrote, if someone had predicted earlier this century that the presidents of Princeton, Dartmouth, and Harvard would one day be named Shapiro, Friedman, and Rudenstein, he would have been laughed out of town. Now, of course, he could have added Yale. While a student there, I was the editor-in-chief of the Daily. This met by convention a weekly one-hour meeting with the president of Yale, a courtly New England-bred historian, Charles Seymour. In one of those sessions, he complained of certain taboos that had crystallized in recent years, among them that one could no longer speak of the Jews as having any, quote, group characteristics. Of course, that's nonsense, he said. They do have group characteristics, so do we Protestants, so do you Catholics, but you aren't supposed to say it. Many years later, I repeated this observation to an urbane friend, a journalist and author. He agreed that you can't ascribe group characteristics to Jews. But a little while later, in connection with a very different point, I heard him telling me that as a Jew, he was proud of two traits common among his fellow Jews. The first, a true thirst for justice. The second, what he called a sense of the book, by which he meant a desire to learn. Conversely, he said he disliked what he saw as a proclivity among many Jews to a self-imposed tribalism and a tendency of some to violate their own ethical precepts owing to a vulnerability to greed, his word. This was a venture in group characterization, but such was not the purpose of my excursion in my book, whose aims are more modest, namely to describe a context within which it becomes possible to identify what can defensibly be thought of as anti-Semitism, and at the same time to ask what is wrongly thought of or denounced as anti-Semitic. If it is anti-Semitic to believe that there are group characteristics among Jews of a given generation and common culture, then anti-Semitism indeed lingers, but in that case many Jews are themselves guilty of it. I devoted a lot of time and space to examining four phenomena, two of them featuring conservative writers, a third featuring a left-wing writer in a left-wing magazine, the fourth featuring a student publication. About my colleague, Joe Sobran, I concluded first that he did not feel bound by protocols I felt he should honor, and second, that readers of some of his work could reasonably conclude that he was anti-Semitic. About Gore Vidal, unquestionably an anti-Semite, I concluded that the left enjoys social liberties not available to the American right, which liberties, were they to extend to us, I would hope we would disdain to exercise. About the Dartmouth Review, I concluded that here was an outstanding example of an irresponsible imputation of anti-Semitism. About Pat Buchanan, who declared his candidacy for president the week in which my essay appeared, I summarized the case with a sentence, only the first half of which was quoted by most of his critics in subsequent weeks and months, ignoring the important qualifier. Only Joe Sobran replied directly to my essay. He remains convinced that it is only the policies of the State of Israel that attract his critical attention. But my exploration asked whether his objections are restricted to such policies, or whether they are restricted to such policies when exercised by the State of Israel. I asked, in effect, whether, no doubt unconsciously, an anti-Israeli, anti-Semitic tropism directs his criticism. Sobran considers that the term anti-Semitism is, for all intents and purposes nowadays, only a polemical weapon. Anti-Semitism, he wrote, only seems to show up nowadays in the context of discussions of Israel. Jews aren't beaten in the streets, snubbed, denied entry to Harvard. By every other index, anti-Semitism is defunct. Yet the Zionist apparat wants to convince us it's raging just beneath the surface. It talks about polite and sophisticated and thinly veiled anti-Semitism. For some reason, the stuff never gets overt. It always has to be exposed by interpretation. These ostensible qualifiers don't really qualify either. When you're accused of polite anti-Semitism, your accuser is not saying, well, he may be an anti-Semite, but at least he's polite. He's saying, this guy's politeness is phony. Strip away the fake good manners, and he's just another Hitler. Joe Sobran's intolerance of anti-Semitic agitation by no means monopolizes intolerance in this field. I would see in the weeks and months ahead manifestations of intolerance on both sides of the general question. I found this most striking in the case of Abe Rosenthal. And I pause to say this because it is relevant, namely that we are and have been good friends for over 20 years. But he is not unique. The columnist Richard Cohen of the Washington Post, for instance, was not satisfied to make a public finding at the expense of Sobran or Buchanan. He wanted them both fired as journalists. Cohen wrote, Buckley himself rejects particular Sobran writings but embraces the whole man. But anti-Semitism can be deduced from the way a person conducts himself. In Sobran's case, the conduct in question is his writings, and those put his anti-Semitism beyond doubt. I don't happen to agree with John Stuart Mill that all questions are in doubt for so long as there is a single dissenter. But I don't believe either that defenders of Sobran or of Buchanan are found only among eccentrics. One letter I received after my essay was published was from Rabbi Daniel Lapin of the Pacific Jewish Center in Venice, California, who wrote to say, Mr. Buckley, I'm not sure that I fully understand the fuss about Sobran. The writing of Richard Cohen et al. Strikes me as disingenuous. Sobran's Pensées in National Review, December 31, 1985, on the other hand, laid the foundations of a dozen sermons in my synagogue. But that was only a taste of the whirlwind to come. Pat Buchanan became the hot potato of the season, as one would expect, given that he'd become a presidential candidate. I gave very concrete attention to Pat Buchanan in that essay. Here's what he actually said and did, or at least what he said and did that brought on the explosion. On television, the McLaughlin program, he said, quote, there are only two groups that are beating the drums for war in the Middle East, the Israeli Defense Ministry and its Amen Corner in the United States. Later in the program, he was more explicit, his purpose obviously being to emphasize the singular interest the Israelis and their friends had in stopping Saddam Hussein. Quote, the Israelis want this war desperately because they want the United States to destroy the Iraqi war machine. They want us to finish them off. They don't care about our relations with the Arab world. Now, at this point, nothing has actually been said that is anti-Semitic in character, let alone arrogantly so. Any threatened nation is concerned for its own interests, over against which others' interests are understandably subordinate. What had been done, however, was to pronounce a massive inaccuracy, namely that, quote, only two specified groups favored military action against Hussein, given that approximately 75% of the American people, that was the figure the polls then told us were supporting administration policies, were in favor of action against Hussein. Buchanan was deluding himself or his listeners, or both. And one cannot persuasively contend that people who read and heard Buchanan say such things weren't tantalized by this display of ignorance in so cosmopolitan a journalist, and wondered what were his motives. Buchanan did not at that point wade back into shallower water. On the contrary, coincidental with his reference to the Amen Corner, he pronounced the names of 4 important men who influenced public policy, whom he identified with a hyper-bellicose wing of the anti-Saddam forces. He named A.M. Rosenthal, the columnist and former executive editor of the New York Times, Richard Pearl, executive editor of the New York Times, former Assistant Secretary of Defense and leader of the hawkish legions during the Cold War, columnist Charles Krauthammer, an influential moral political strategist with Wilsonianist internationalist inclinations, and Henry Kissinger. They have in common many things, but in the context of the polemical offensive by Buchanan, the most conspicuous of these is that they're all Jewish. This common denominator assaults the analytical mind in a way it wouldn't if the 4 strategists had been uniquely identifiable as advocates of a tough line against Saddam Hussein. But A.M. Rosenthal, columnist, was no more belligerent on the Hussein issue than James Jackson Kilpatrick, columnist. Richard Pearl, no more than Frank Gaffney, his former colleague Charles Krauthammer, no more than George Will, and Henry Kissinger, no more than his national security advisor successor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, for Christians. The circumstantial evidence that the Jewish factor was engrossing Buchanan mounted. And then whatever coincidences might in desperation have been pleaded for this aggregation of all Jewish anti-Hussein activists, their usefulness expired when Pat Buchanan went on to write that if we went to war, the fighting would be done by, quote, kids with names like McAllister, Murphy, Gonzalez, and Leroy Brown. There is no way to read that sentence without concluding that Pat Buchanan was suggesting that American Jews managed to avoid personal military exposure, even while advancing military policies they enthusiastically endorse. Buchanan had his defenders. They reasoned for the most part as follows. A, anti-Semitism is a disgraceful mindset. B, Pat Buchanan, given his exemplary character, has no disgraceful mindsets. Therefore, C, it has to be incorrect to say of him that he is anti-Semitic. This is, of course, to reason a priori, and there has seldom in modern controversy been a clearer case of a collision course between 2 structures of logical thought. A posteriori reasoning would take what was said or written and reason to the mindset of the person who said or wrote those words, in this case excluding any possibility other than that they were motivated by A, ignorance, or B, a desire to taunt or to express hostility. Time magazine's reviewer tried to find a middle course. Quote, what set them off, wrote William Henry about Buchanan's critics, was a typical Buchanan crack, which wrapped a core of fact in a coating of hyperbole. But Henry did concede, touching on the central question, that, quote, for years Buchanan has appeared to go out of his way to rile Jewish sensitivities. But there were hardliners on the conservative front, for instance, David Frum, who, replying to Robert Novak's "he's a jolly good fellow" line, did so with some exasperation. It is simply bizarre to suggest, as Robert Novak seems to do, that it is unfair to judge a writer by his writings. Patrick Buchanan has put millions of words into print. If the essence of the man is to be found elsewhere, anywhere, it is there, and not in his friends' polite comments about what an affable chap he is. Norman Podhoretz, the distinguished editor of commentary, published a 6-page long, quote, open letter to William F. Buckley Jr. In his Solomonic manner, he pronounced himself as agreeing with me, quotes, on 80%, unquotes, of what I wrote, and he had no difficulty whatever in agreeing that critical to the question of anti-Semitism was indeed Israel. How, in respect of Israel, has the defendant behaved? On an earlier situation in which the question of anti-Semitism was broadly raised, it was after the invasion of Lebanon by Israel in 1982, an invasion so heatedly criticized in so many quarters. Mr. Podhoretz had classified as anti-Semitic anyone who quote, ascribes to Jews negative characteristics as uniquely Jewish, or correlatively denies to Jews rights granted to others. His particular point being that Israel's attack on Lebanon was justified by pleading the rights that conventionally attach to beleaguered countries. Everyone begins by conceding that mere criticism of Israel's policies does not in and of itself amount to anti-Semitism. But this does not mean that nobody does just that in the cause of fighting anti-Semitism, specifically some branches of organized American Jewish lobbies. Some people wanted to know what is justifiable retaliation against critics of Israel who are reasonably suspected of being motivated by anti-Semitism. On this point, I quoted Alan Brownfield, who had transpired as a consistent critic of Israel, even though he is himself Jewish. He had written, quotes, "The Anti-Defamation League is part of a larger coalition of groups, some of which have assumed for themselves the role of attempting to silence those advocating ideas with which these groups disagree. The Near East Report, the House organ of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, urged its readers to exert pressure on local newspapers around the country to replace Pat Buchanan's column with that of another conservative columnist, such as George Will." Now, the very idea of an active Jewish lobby was found offensive by some readers, not so much because such a lobby shouldn't exist, but because it should be mistakenly thought of as representing the views of all American Jews. Eric Alterman, an author and frequent contributor of The Nation, made the point shrewdly. At first, his two positions appear to be contradictory. As he explains them, they are not. The first was that it is presumptuous to refer to, quotes, Jewish opinion, as he put it. Quotes, "To Abe Rosenthal, Buchanan's indictment implicates all Jews, including, I imagine, my 11-month-old nephew." Manifestly, he wrote, "This is absurd." On the other hand, Alterman acknowledges and defends the activities of the Jewish-Israeli lobby. Jewish pressure, as he puts it, is thrown around all the time in Washington, and it is done proudly. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobby in Washington, has spent the past 10 years purposefully building and enhancing its reputation for deploying its Jewish pressure on matters it deems to be of Jewish concern, from Egypt to El Salvador. In that regard, anyway, it has done a pretty fair job. Just what did Rosenthal think AIPAC Director Thomas Dine had in mind back in 1984 when he announced, after the defeat of Senator Charles Percy, who supported the establishment of a Palestinian entity that, quotes, "all the Jews in America from coast to coast gathered to oust Percy"? And the American politicians, those who hold the public positions now, and those who aspire to public positions, got the message, concludes Alterman. He's amused, or rather not amused, by AIPAC's gyrations on the matter of freedom of expression. Quotes, following on Rosenthal's column on Buchanan, he wrote, "AIPAC sent an advisory to its 50,000 members, encouraging to meet with newspaper editors in order to, quote, ask them if they believe the Buchanans are presenting information their readers want. No one is saying the Buchanans should have no right to express their views. Who, AIPAC? Of course not, says Alderman. But just the same, AIPAC would like to see Buchanan silenced and replaced with pundits who are fair-minded when it comes to the Middle East. Buchanan is perhaps being a bit paranoid, Alderman concludes, when he suspects a pre-planned, orchestrated smear campaign designed to deprive him of his readership. But with AIPAC and Rosenthal after him, need we remind ourselves, he concludes, that even paranoids have real enemies. We're left with the question how to train the moral and analytical faculties to single out with some sense of confidence those critics of Israeli policies who, whether they know it or not, are primarily motivated by hostility to a Jewish state. The sentence with which I concluded my careful examination of Pat Buchanan utterances, for instance, is equivocal, even though it was for the most part not taken as such because the qualifier was not everywhere cited. What I concluded by saying was, I find it impossible to defend Pat Buchanan against the charge that what he did and said during the period under examination amounted to anti-Semitism. Whatever it was that drove him to say and do it, most probably an iconoclastic temperament. There could not be, on the other hand, ambiguity in the extraordinary affair involving Gore Vidal in The Nation magazine, which dated back to 1986, when on its celebratory 120th anniversary edition, it published a piece by Vidal in which he said in as many words that Podhoretz and his wife Midge Decter and the whole pro-Israel lobby were not loyal Americans, their primary attachment being to Israel. This essay was an epical event in the history of American cultural and anti-Semitism, not so much because Vidal wrote as he did, but because of the refusal of so many sponsors of The Nation to disavow his article and to rebuke the Jewish editor of The Nation for publishing it. Norman Podhoretz devoted the lead essay and commentary in November 1986 to a long article he called The Hate That Dare Not Speak Its Name. He wrote about the failure of the Vidal piece to mobilize the community generally associated with interracial hygiene. But Podhoretz failed to rouse the troops. The most plausible explanation is that anti-Semitism is getting frail as it walks into senior citizenship 50 years after the Holocaust. And granted, an anti-Semitic crack like Buchanan's isn't the kind of thing that threatens a return to Auschwitz. In the post-Hitler world, the flight path of workaday anti-Semitism isn't genocidal. Restraint is enjoined rather by civility and reverence than by any sense of clear and present danger. To call somebody a whore in Hollywood exposes her to a different order of discomfort from calling someone a whore in 17th century Salem. Yet the discontinuity notwithstanding, the offense remains meretricious. The lingering pain comes from the historical knowledge that in the lifetime of many of us, cultural prejudice could and did metastasize into Auschwitz. There are utterly unprejudiced professionals who step forward in reaction to my essay to protest their handling by Mr. Podhoretz. For instance, Edwin Yoder and William Pfaff, the columnists, who, reacting against the invasion of Lebanon by Israel in 1982, admonished that U.S. policy is servile to an organized Jewish American lobby hell-bent on serving narrow Israeli interests and prepared to use indiscriminately the weapon of alleged anti-Semitism to immobilize the opposition. But then there are those, and they are entitled to be heard out, who believe that there is detectable in some people's criticisms of Israel an animus, that animus is traceable to anti-Semitic dispositions, and that these dispositions need hosing down by moral exposure for fear that that great fever might rekindle, which once gave us the Holocaust. How do the offenders defend themselves? Well, Gore Vidal does so by assaulting his critics. For instance, to the objections raised by Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg, he replied ad hominem and sighed that, quote, "Luckily, I'm used to being lied about," prompting my comment that anyone who lies about Mr. Vidal is doing him a kindness. Some critics dare to say that, in fact, Israeli practices are racist and discriminatory. When in 1975 the United Nations General Assembly resolved that Zionism, quote, is a form of racism, the declaration, subsequently repealed, as we know, elicited the contempt it deserved. But that contempt had to cope with an observation of the Kuwaiti delegate, who noted that Article 1 of the UN's Declaration on, quote, the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination included under the term, quote, racial discrimination, quote, any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on national or ethnic origin. Zionism, he charged, endorses, quote, concrete practices which have the effect of excluding some people on the basis of their being non-Jews and including others on the basis of their being Jews, Jewishness being defined officially as an ethnic and not a strictly religious definition. That's true. But to use this argument as dispositive in denouncing Zionism as racism is to disallow Zionism as a legitimate sponsor of a Jewish homeland. Discussion of the legitimacy of Israel becomes inherently unprofitable inasmuch as any resolution that says that Jews cannot sponsor a homeland for other Jews, defined as such by Jewish doctrine, is hardly worth having. Certain Israeli practices are anything but endearing. A recent issue of Time magazine talks of Gary and Shirley Bursford, both born of Jewish parents in South Africa. Shirley, 52, a housewife, lost an aunt and uncle in the Holocaust. Other members of her family were among Israel's pioneers, and two of her sons served as paratroopers in the Israeli army. She and Gary, 42, a marketing manager by training, were married in an Orthodox synagogue 11 years ago. They rest on the Sabbath, keep kosher, and fast on Yom Kippur. Despite all that, the Israeli government considers the couple outside the fold and wants them gone. The Bursford's transgression, they worship Jesus Christ. These strictures, as I say, are unappealing to people brought up on a Bill of Rights. But one is not entitled to disestablish a Jewish state for the offense of observing Jewish laws. Such laws relating to Jewish religion are different from state policies that have nothing to do with religion. And the question arose whether it is a mark of anti-Semitism to impose selectively demanding judgments on Israeli state behavior, as is done by such critics of Israeli domestic policies as Anthony Lewis. His reaction to the charge that he imposes harsher judgments on Israel than on other countries was given in a letter he addressed to me. Yes, he said, there is a double standard in judging Israel. From its birth, Israel asked to be judged as a light among the nations. Columnist William Pfaff spoke directly on the subject, quote, Israelis and Israel's friends often complain that Americans and Europeans attack Israel for faults they ignore in the conduct of other countries. This is true. I do so myself because I consider Israel part of the political and moral community in which I live, to which I am committed, and for which I feel a responsibility. I am surprised that anyone would wish Israel to be judged by any other standards than those of the liberal, democratic Western community. During its history, Israel has put forward 4 arguments in support of its special claim on the support of the West, and of America in particular. The first of these is, in effect, reparations for the Holocaust. The second, its fidelity to the West during the Cold War. The third, its democratic singularity in a virulently anti-democratic part of the world. And the fourth, and by far the most muted, Judaism's covenantal entanglement with Christianity. from which derives the religio-moral obligation of Christians to ensure the survival of the Jews. The first of these claims declines as time distances us from the Holocaust. The second evanesces with the end of the Cold War. The third is of diminishing strength as that portion of America's pro-democratic fervor that was animated by Cold War alliances diminishes. We are left with a fourth claim, which, however, makes the more secularized Jewish community, in combination with the hyper-Orthodox, uncomfortable. The result of all this is a continuing effort to invigorate the first claim, but probably against the competing tug in America toward policies oriented not only to post-Nazi but to post-Holocaust priorities. These inevitably inspire the most heated efforts of the Israeli lobby. The reactions to my essay greatly deepened my understanding of the phenomena. The response from Jewish readers was astonishing as to diversity and range. Joe Sobran defended himself vigorously. An anti-Semite in actual usage, he wrote, is less often a man who hates Jews than a man certain Jews hate. The word expresses the emotional explosion that occurs in people who simply can't bear critical discourse about a sacred topic and who experience criticism as profanation and blasphemy. The term anti-Semitism doesn't stand for any intelligible concept. It belongs not to the world of rational discourse, but to the realm of imprecations and maledictions and ritual ostracisms. And woe unto him, even in this modern secular world of ours, upon whom this curse is pronounced. Joe may have had the right to be indignant, but certainly not the right to be surprised. Inasmuch as I had a half-dozen times in the preceding year or two dilated on the dangers, professional and moral, of the minefield he was electing to kick up his heels in. It's important to make clear that I am talking about a minefield the editors of National Review substantially approve of, alarms that go off when people venture inadvertently or by design toward a dark and toxic place whose name becomes decipherable only after one has trod too far. The sign on that hostelry reads, Ezra Pound slept here. Besides which, I made the point that National Review is proof that the Israeli right or wrong lobby does not control all effective opinion. I quoted several instances in which National Review and I had made critical references to Israeli policies, or else commented on those of others, making it difficult for Sobran convincingly to argue that criticisms of him were owing only to insufficient servility. Joe Sobran had complained not only about a dumb civility to Israel, but complained also that although my essay had been subtitled, What Do Some Christians Do That Annoys American Jews, and vice versa, I had paid no attention to the vice versa. This was not the case. I castigated the behavior of the president of Dartmouth College, James Friedman, for insisting that the Dartmouth Review was a rat's nest of anti-Semitism. Norman Podhoretz, reviewing the evidence in his own essay and commentary, agreed in the open letter he addressed to me, quotes, I am with you all the way in your section exonerating the Dartmouth Review of the charge of anti-Semitism. In the Dartmouth Review, we have a genuine example of false charges of anti-Semitism doing damage to innocent victims. They would be a disappointing sequel, not to use the word outrageous. Early in March, 8 weeks after my own exposition, 4 weeks after Podhoretz's, and 12 months after the Anti-Defamation League itself had conducted an exploration of the Dartmouth Review, the ADL's Boston chapter voted an award to Dartmouth President James Friedman for what? A local newspaper reports that, quote, referring to the incident in which a Hitler quote appeared in the logo of the Dartmouth Review. ADL Regional Vice Chairman Richard Glofsky, 69, described Friedman's response as heroic. Jim Friedman stood up to outrageous conduct. Glofsky told the room of alumni, college presidents, friends of Friedman, supporters of the ADL, thanks to leaders like Jim Friedman, there is hope. Oh, but that's exactly the opposite of the case. Leaders like James Friedman give anti-Semitism a bad name for the very simple reason that he imputed anti-Semitism to a dozen Dartmouth student editors who had never waded in that mire, who were entirely innocent of the Hitler quote incident, rather than seek to establish the identity of a mischievous student, call him evil if you wish, who managed surreptitiously to insert an anti-Semitic sentence from Adolf Hitler into the logo of the student newspaper. Friedman had called a campus-wide rally to denounce the staff of the Dartmouth Review as racist and bigoted. What is ironic is that Mr. Glowski, who did the purring on the night in question in praise of Mr. Friedman, himself headed up the inquiry into the Dartmouth Review incident on behalf of the Boston ADL, invited to do so by the same editors denounced by Friedman. The ADL report, when issued, quite explicitly denied that there were grounds for concluding that the Hitler quote was an official act representing racist attitudes of any responsible member of the Review, whose editor, by the way, was black. Mr. Abraham Foxman, who is the national director of the Anti-Defamation League, had only a few weeks earlier reacted to my own essay, the same essay that prompted Mr. Podhoretz to exonerate the Dartmouth Review, by writing to me that essay included quotes, "Clearly reflects your well-deserved reputation for intellectual honesty and will enlighten all who take the opportunity and show the good sense to read it." But that apparently did not include Mr. Glowski, the head of the Boston chapter. Incredibly, the ADL officials did not stop with the award to Mr. Friedman. In a letter addressed to a Boston paper, they added a ritualistic defense of their award and then added quotes, "It is also difficult to understand how Mr. Buckley and other conservative figures could have failed to speak out against the Hitler quote when it appeared. To members of the commission, this silence reflected a serious failure of leadership and understanding of the hurtful impact of this highly inflammatory act." That statement is, to put it kindly, beneath contempt. It would suggest that critics of the newspaper, one of whose staffers had surreptitiously inserted into the logo a passage from the Marquis de Sade, should begin their commentary on the episode by denouncing sadism. But most appalling of all was this, quote, "It is also noteworthy," the ADL wrote to the newspaper, "that Mr. Buckley chose not to mention that the Dartmouth Review pays, quote, special thanks to him in each and every one of its issues. It is from this position that Mr. Buckley defends the Review," end quote. In the 2-month-old essay already praised by the head of the ADL in his letter to me, appeared the following footnote in my chapter on the Dartmouth Review, quotes, "I should here record that the Dartmouth Review, from the first issue on, has included in one of its many tiers on the masthead special thanks to William F. Buckley Jr. I have never been told exactly why this practice originated or at whose prompting. I have never been consulted by the editors about policy. I would assume the review ended the homage, but I continue to feel it would be ungrateful, even snotty, to say so. I say so now only under duress in a document that requires me to specify my exact relationship with the review." One is, I think, entitled to wonder whether Messrs. Foxman and Glowski took the trouble to read their own report on the Dartmouth Review before deciding to lionize President Friedman, or read my essay before writing to congratulate me on it. So here was a blatant example of indefensible activity by an official Jewish organization charged to promote mutual respect. That example was flushed out by my essay, but mostly the essay illuminated a membrane of uneasiness. This was caught in the letter from Irving Kristol, quotes, "My reaction was one of surprise," Irving Kristol wrote. "I am certainly not insensitive to anti-Semitism, but it has been my distinct impression that there is probably less of it today than at any other period in my lifetime. I grew up in the shadow of Hitlerism and was disturbed, to put it mildly, by the echoes of Hitler's anti-Semitism to be found on the fringes of the America First movement. So I have vivid memories of the bad old days, and I therefore have been inclined to be rather dismissive of the current intermittent marginal symptoms that one occasionally reads about. After all, today something in excess of 1/3 of all Jews marry Gentiles, and I have been more interested in this fact as a portent for American Jewry than in some young punks defacing a Jewish cemetery or vandalizing a synagogue. But then I recall that the intermarriage rate in Germany under the Weimar Republic was just about as high as that, and I begin to wonder whether there is a kind of autoimmune response within a body politic still overwhelmingly Christian. Buckley's essay has persuaded me that I have indeed been too complacent. Some months ago, the New Republic sent around a questionnaire asking respondents their opinion as to whether Pat Buchanan's columns were anti-Semitic, as some were claiming. I said then that I did not believe that Buchanan, whom I've known for some years, was personally or politically anti-Semitic, but rather had allowed his irritation with the liberal commitment of the majority of the Jewish community to spill over into remarks that, if uttered by someone else, could easily be taken to be anti-Semitic. I would now revise that judgment. I still cannot find it in my heart to say that Pat Buchanan is personally anti-Semitic, but he definitely is politically so. This finding is heatedly disputed by Robert Novak, who chose rather to stress the point Buchanan and Sobran had been making about the indiscriminate use of the epithet. He wrote, "Because the Novak-Evans column has frequently been critical of official Israeli policies, we have carefully scrubbed every one of the hundreds of such columns we have written to eliminate all wording that might be deemed offensive. For example, when the Israeli government complained years ago that our reference to it as Tel Aviv, as the American government is called Washington, and the former Soviet government was called Moscow, in journalistic jargon, came straight out of Arab propaganda, we instantly stopped the practice, even though few states recognize Jerusalem as the Israeli capital, to no avail. We've been continually accused of anti-Semitism, even though our criticisms of Israeli government policy mirrors the position of many prominent Israelis. Making accusations of anti-Semitism is a serious business. In the nearly 29-year run of the Evans-Novak column, we have been attacked properly by those we attack, but the only sustained, serious, and organized effort to silence us has come from the pro-Israel lobby. Attempts have been made often by advertisers to remove our column from newspapers, occasionally with success. Some readers wished to explore questions that had to do with Jewish distinctiveness. Elliot Cohn, whose name appears on the masthead of both the New Republic and the National Review, stressed a dimension of Jewish fear not frequently alluded to. Let me suggest, he wrote, 2 reasons why Jews are sometimes hypersensitive about anti-Semitism. One has to do with the intensely historical character of Jewish religious practice. On the 9th day of Av, which falls in the summer, comes the black fast of Tisha B'Av, 26 hours without food or drink spent in mourning, reading from Lamentations, how doth the city sit solitary that was full of people, and dirges composed in the Middle Ages, although there is now a separate day on which the Holocaust is remembered officially. On the 9th day of Av, in most congregations, recently composed dirges are added to those we have recited for many centuries. They fit all too well. Judaism, like Islam, leads its adherents to ponder their history long and hard. It is not the Holocaust alone that makes American Jews, who have had such an extraordinarily easy time of it, touchy about anti-Semitism. Consider, he concluded, that for Jews who care about their Jewishness, survival is at stake, even in America. Our anxiety about survival is only partly reflected in an intense reaction to anti-Semitism, and is often conflated with it, even by Jews. The survival of the Jews is at risk in the United States, not merely because of hostility, but because of the very reverse, and chiefly because of Jewish readiness to abandon our traditions and beliefs. That this may be hard to appreciate has driven home to me in a conversation with a sophisticated non-Jewish friend who simply could not understand what it was to have a collective, not an individual, fear of extinction, be it through physical annihilation or assimilation. There are Jews for whom anti-Semitism ends by defining their Jewishness. Alan Dershowitz sometimes seems to me a representative of this type. That this is unhealthy and sterile goes without saying. What Jewish child would want to live a Jewish life if the chief characteristic of such a life were the search for and occasional discovery of mortal enemies? The greater one's belief in the wealth and richness of Judaism, the less tragedy defines one's Jewishness. But to be a Jew is also to be aware that Jewish existence is tenuous. And Professor Cohen came directly to the point on the matter of Israel. But I will say that for better or for worse, Judaism, including all but the fringe elements of Orthodox Judaism, is now tied up with the existence of a healthy state of Israel. Were it to perish, I doubt that the Jews could survive as a faith or as a people. Professor Manfred Weidhorn of Yeshiva wrote feelingly about the exposure of Jews to anti-Jewishness. Christianity bears a heavy responsibility, he wrote, for the prevalence of anti-Semitism, but not an exclusive one. Anti-Semitism existed before Christianity, Apion, Tacitus, Juvenal, and existed outside it in certain circles in Japan and parts of the Muslim world. The ubiquity of this moral plague can be smugly written off by Jews as a jealousy all people have of one people doing things right. Or it can make conscientious Jews ask themselves whether they are not doing something wrong. Jews are not, he continued, in fact, entirely blameless. The concept of the chosen people has played a mischievous role in history. Rabbis are always quick to explain that chosenness bears no relation to notions of Aryan supremacy, racial superiority, American exceptionalism, or any of the garden variety chauvinism that exists in Japan, France, Russia. Chosenness, they insist, means rather for Jews an extra set of moral obligations. Gentiles only have to observe a few Noahide principles, but Jews are saddled with no less than 613 commandments, the majority of them to boot, beginning with the unfortunate thou shalt not. Jews, accordingly, are not in any sense superior, but more burdened. Modern psychologists, he concludes, and novelists have, however, noted how a burden of this sort has an insidious way of turning into an unacknowledged sense of superiority. I am more morally constrained than you are, some inner voice says, because I am more worthy of such a mission than you are. We are morally and ritually far more burdened than you, therefore we are purified by self-sacrifice and heavenward gazes. Therefore we are wiser and probably nobler than the spiritually virginal, the naive, and untested Gentiles. Is there a silver lining to the kind of hostility he describes? Professor Weidhorn says, yes, there is. That it is as generated by the idea of chosenness and exclusiveness. The exclusiveness, he says, may well be a necessity for group cohesiveness and survival. It also, however, generates aggression in others. And this hostility, as Sartre et al. Have noted, in turn is curiously beneficial for group cohesiveness and survival. Full-time professional chauvinist Jews exist who, in their heart of hearts, cannot regard anti-Semitism, at least in its milder, genteel form, with complete disfavor. There were numerous brief reactions. I enjoyed that of Professor John Roach, sometime aide to Lyndon Johnson, sometime president of Americans for Democratic Action. Quotes, wanted to tell you what a splendid piece of analysis your anti-Semitism study was. One of the things that has always annoyed me was the assertion that Marshall, Atchison, Rusk were anti-Semites in 47, 48. They simply did not want another loose cannon in Levant. And as Rusk told me once, I wish to hell that God had promised them Nebraska. There was the final round in which I reached certain conclusions after pondering what my original essay had catalyzed. Abe Rosenthal wrote in his column that Mr. Buchanan has not only introduced anti-Semitism into the mainstream of American politics, he has made it acceptable. respectable enough to ignore, and potentially profitable. I ruled my old friend Mr. Rosenthal and those who saw eye to eye with him as outside the useful speaking limits of the discussion of anti-Semitism. I concluded simultaneously that Joe Sobran simply did not understand. It was a memorandum from a colleague of Joe Sobran of mine, Professor Jeffrey Hart of Dartmouth, that struck me with the greatest force. He wrote, "I conclude that Israel is literally sacred to much or almost all Jewish opinion. And I mean sacred taking the term with full literalness." I interrupt Professor Hart to say that I showed his memorandum to a very close friend, the writer and journalist Richard Clerman. His comment was that literally sacred is exactly the wrong term, that Israel is, quote, sacred to most Jews as a secular, not a sacred concern, and that this qualifier applies equally to Jews in Israel and in America. He and his wife are both Jewish. Quotes, "It is sacred only in the sense that it is uniquely cherished, not in the sense, say, that the Vatican would be held to be sacred to American Catholics or Bethlehem to all Christians. It is unwise ever to suggest that the state of Israel is a theological concern to most Jews. It is not, even though it is a theocratic state." To continue with Professor Hart's memorandum, Sobran and Buchanan, on the other hand, have insisted on treating Israel as just another nation and interpreting U.S. policy toward it as an entirely secular problem. I ran into this problem with Norman Podhoretz when he expressed great disappointment in my public support for Buchanan in New Hampshire. My response to him was that, one, this week we're talking about the record of George Bush, and two, next week we can talk about anti-Semitism, protectionism, isolationism, and whatnot. No, sirree. I flunked for Norman on the sacred question. Now, I can understand, he continues, why Israel, in fact, has become sacred. The history of the 20th century is, to put it mildly, unique. The Holocaust is a sort of hole in the cosmos, a guarantor of the existence of evil. It is an equivalent for Jews of the crucifixion. Israel then became the equivalent of the redemption. This is true even for relatively secular Jews. Judaism has never successfully separated God and tribe. The people itself is the God carrier. So along comes Joe Sobran, rattling around in all this and discussing Israel as if it were a policy matter, just another country like, say, Belgium. I think that from a full experience of the 20th century, I am willing to accept the sacredness of Israel as a religious fact. Hegel did not foresee this in his Phenomenology of the Spirit, but there it is, indubitably a fact. In concluding my book, I forced on myself a question positioned on Pat Buchanan because so much of what had been written focused on what he had said and done. Suppose, I asked myself, that the case against Buchanan rested exclusively on his attitude towards Israel. Could one then feel safe in concluding, as unflinchingly as Mr. Podhoretz concludes, that Pat Buchanan had earned the designation anti-Semite? And should he then be disqualified by right-thinking people from consideration as a presidential candidate? Is it de facto anti-Semitic to be anti the state of Israel? My answer to both those questions is yes, A, yes, B. Yes, I'd oppose him for high public office, and B, yes, I would classify him as anti-Semitic. Let's go on. Do we gain perspective by asking correlative questions? Suppose they were documented about a candidate that he was anti-Catholic. Most of us are familiar with the cliche that anti-Catholicism is the anti-Semitism of the highbrow. And most Catholics have experienced, if not they are nevertheless aware of its practice, anti-Catholicism. Should all such candidates be excluded from office? It's not as easy to answer this question affirmatively, because one needs to ask the question, what harm can reasonably be expected to come to Catholics by reason of the political ascendancy of an anti-Catholic in the United States? There is no geographical promontory out there populated by Catholics who are exposed to terminal persecution. Under the communist persecution was so general, its victims were Christians and Jews, gypsies and kulaks, artists and poets, that it was never practical to mobilize Catholic sentiment in the United States for the specific purpose of bringing aid and relief to Catholics living behind the Iron Curtain. Although in the history of America, Catholics have been persecuted, that experience is remote, pretty much remote also for Jews, and one day not too far distant, we must hope, remote also for blacks. There is no lowering threat against Catholics internally, though as patrons of parochial schools, they are the primary victims of what I think of as First Amendment fanaticism. But I repeat, there is no Catholic Israel out there, surrounded by Catholic-hating Muslims who have 5 times attempted to drive the Catholics to the sea and into it. I would hesitate, therefore, to endorse a blanket proscription against an anti-Catholic candidate. In other words, I am ready to concede that in our world, in our time, Jews have inherited distinctive immunities. The question of Israel is in 2 parts. The first asks, isn't it possible to oppose Israel and yet still be free of the taint of anti-Semitism? My own answer is deeply affected by commentary elicited by my original essay, which commentary holds convincingly that in the absence of definitive military aid by the United States, the probabilities are high that Israel would be extinguished. It would follow that any American president unwilling to support Israel militarily would be inviting the elimination of the Jewish state and its people. How will the events here chronicled play out in the years ahead? After the Second World War, there was time, and never a better opportunity to do so, to absorb the ultimate consequences of anti-Semitism. The details were gruesomely abundant. A reversal in public attitudes went forward, so to speak, in high gear. In the fashionable colleges and universities where Jewish scholars had been denied tenure, there was sharp action designed to redress manifest wrongs. Complementary changes affected student life, and soon it was all but impossible to find a fraternity or student society that denied membership to an undergraduate because he was Jewish. Meanwhile, the older generation, which had grown up in a culture oriented towards anti-Semitism, retreated. I can't document it, but I have the feeling there was a deep Christian fear that some would think of the Holocaust as an aspect of Christian eschatology. Clearly, any such profanation worried those whose anti-Semitism was of a kind that limited itself to admissions policies and country clubs. And for others, there was what I think of as a simple fatigue with the question that, together with the manifest futility of denying the meritocratic claims of a generation of young Jews so conspicuously qualified to compete with the acculturated Christian in any activity. Along with this integration came, of course, that progressive indistinctiveness of the Jews, remarked upon in some of the commentary above. The way to establish that a person was Jewish could not be done by trailing him on the Sabbath to see where it was that he worshiped, because mostly he worshiped nowhere at all. And in this sense, it had become as commonplace as the American Protestant, so many of whom attend church in order to be baptized, married, and buried, with occasional drop-ins on Easter Sunday and at Christmas. But whatever the dilution of Jewish religious culture, what remained is Israel. In some ways an incarnation, in some ways a sepulcher. Whatever the blend of the two, sacred. An American conservatism that showed itself indifferent to so solemn a responsibility is not the American conservatism I have grown up with and devoted my life to helping to shape. Thank you.
I want to thank Mr. Buckley for his enlightening and courageous analysis and for being with us here this evening. Mr. Buckley has agreed to answer a few of your questions, and then we will adjourn to the adjacent art gallery for a book selling and signing. Yes. I will repeat the question. Okay, let me just repeat the first question is, if Jews or Israel will behave differently, would that diminish anti-Semitism or influence anti-Semitism?
Number two, I think if anti-Semitism totally disappeared, that would mean that we as Jews disappeared as well.
Second question is, if anti-Semitism disappears, do we as Jews... Oh. Okay, the man makes a statement, if anti-Semitism disappears, he feels we as Jews or identity may disappear.
Well, I did mention somewhere along the line that there are commentators on the scene who, however obliquely, say to you, when you're a certain amount of anti-Semitism encourages the kind of ethnocentrism which we want, i.e., to remind people that they are in fact Jewish, even as, of course, anti-Catholic and anti-Christian remarks often serve to rekindle one's sense of one's tribal or inherited inclinations. This, of course, is something that has to be accepted with a proper understanding of the boundaries of anti-Semitism. It's one thing to say, oh, those bloody Jews, they're always successful in the stock market. That's something extremely different from the kind of statements that peppered Mein Kampf. On your other point, yes, it is of course true that to the extent that there is social or political behavior traceable to Israel, which is distinctive to it or which duplicates behavior that is elsewhere condemned, it has to be either discountenanced or condemned or understood. One has, I think, to begin in the case of Israel by knowing that it is a beleaguered community. It is highly vulnerable. 5 times efforts have been made to extinguish it, and there's every reason to believe that the hostility that engendered those aggressive attacks still lingers. At the same time, people have got to recognize that there are certain chauvinistic appetites there, roundly condemned by many Israelis, and that it's the appetite of some of them to prevail in the West Bank, never mind democratic niceties, reminds one of policies disapproved of, for instance, when practiced in South Africa, a point that Amos Elon makes. But the presumption, I think, properly is, if the Golan Heights is annexed, is the motivation for doing so primarily a matter of security, or is it in fact an act of imperialism? And here it seems to me that anyone concerned with the matter of physical survival has got to be prepared to be understanding. And this is Golda Meir told me in Jerusalem 15 years ago. He said, you know, it took the United States 25 years to give back Okinawa. And if it took 25 years, given the fact that Japan ceased to be a threat, why should it follow that we should give back our conquered territories sooner than that?
In the interest of time, I would ask you to refrain from comments and keep your questions succinct. Yes, sir.
Could you comment on two situations? The situation at the University of Pennsylvania, where the Jewish student is accused of racism, and the situation with Leonard Jeffries?
The questions are, could you comment, Mr. Buckley, on the situation in Pennsylvania where the Jewish student was accused of racism, and also on the situation with Leonard Jeffries?
On the Pennsylvania situation, it seems to me that you have here an example of the dogmatization of political correctness to the point where it reaches simply indefensible purposes. It horrifies me that the president who is enforcing that policy has meanwhile been called into the cabinet, I forget in what capacity, by Mr. Clinton in respect of what was the other one? What was the other one? Yeah. I am willing to assume the sincerity of the judge that Leonard Jeffries that his dismissal was not processed with reference to the rules that justify breaking a contract. Having said that, I have to say that I have always thought that tenure ought not to be thought of as absolute. The notion that on Monday you can achieve tenure and on Tuesday you can call for the genocide of all gypsies has struck me as an elevation of tenure to a kind of supremacy that makes no sense. The case of Leonard Jeffries seems to me plain that he is less a scholar than a polemicist with a curious and irrational itch, which urges him to promulgate a whole series of doctrines which are indefensible historically. There should be, therefore, a procedure to move against him, which ought to have been summoned against him before this particular episode. So, as I say, not knowing the case, I assume the judge was sincere in saying that a stated code of procedure that has to be followed before tenure is rescinded was not, in his case, followed. But that simply leaves the CCNY with the responsibility of finding defensible means of saying we don't want somebody expressing these opinions, which we reject, as the chairman of the department, let alone as a professor, let alone as the chairman of the department. You will have gathered that my attachment to academic freedom is not absolute. It's not. When John Stuart Mill said that if a single person believes in a particular position, one is not authorized in saying that position has been disproved, it seemed to me that was an absolutist form of epistemology that really adds up to anarchy. If indeed one has to respect or to hold in abeyance one's dismissal of a position because a single person accepts it, then no position will ever be rejected, because you can always find one person who defends every position. So I think that the academic freedom used for those purposes tends to undermine the purposes of academic freedom, among which are, in the course of discovering certain truths, to rule that the corollary of their discovery is the rejection of their opposite. If, in fact, individuals have human rights, then people who say they have no human rights are saying that which is false. And it becomes an objective burden of a society to move against falsehood, even as we move against illiteracy or racism or discrimination.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
How will your book be received in Ronald Reagan's America, or the speech he gave today?
Question is, how would your book or your speech tonight be received in Ronald Reagan's America?
Well, I've heard no important protests. It's true that people who figure directly in it feel that any imputation to them of motives which they are quite confident they are free of is unfair. If Pat Buchanan were here, or my dear friend Joseph Sobran, he would say pretty much what you would expect him to say. So necessarily, when one reaches certain conclusions displeasing to them, one has to expect their expressed hostility. Robert Novak is absolutely plain. He's Jewish, of course. He said the Israel lobby is something that seeks to punish people who criticize Israel. They want the newspapers to drop my column. And the answer is that's quite true of the Israel lobby. And it's quite true that the Anti-Defamation League is capable of simply reversing itself on the subject of the Dartmouth Review, as you have seen. So there's some not very defensible behavior going on out there. And it is true, it's on both sides. On the matter of Reagan's America and Israel, it seems to me that nothing was made plainer than Reagan's absolute commitment to the survival of Israel. It was under Bush that criticisms were made by some Israel supporters that Secretary Baker was pushing too hard against the Israelis on the specific act of the negotiating with the Arab neighbors. That may be true. I don't know. I never doubted at the time. I don't doubt now that the commitment was entirely complete by the Bush administration also to stand by Israel against any threat to its survival.
Yes, ma'am.
According to statistics I read, today, the problem of anti-Semitism is less a problem of the American Christian being anti-Semitic, but more so the black Christian being anti-Semitic. And this, to me, is kind of a strange enigma, considering the fact that a Jew was probably one of the first to fight for civil rights. I can't understand why this has happened.
The question is, this woman observes that black anti-Semitism seems to be on the rise more than white Christian anti-Semitism, and given the history of the Jews in the forefront of the civil rights movement, what do you think may account for this?
Well, that paradox is very widely remarked. Why is it that the blacks have, in so many cases, reacted so violently against people who championed their rights as minorities so persistently over so long a period? Lots of explanations have been offered. This Moynihan, Will Herberg have written on the subject. My own guess is that it probably has to do with a resentment against an upward mobility that the black minority have not been able to equal. If you grow up with impoverished immigrants who arrive without speaking the language, and their children become PhDs from Harvard 25 years later. There is a indefensible but entirely natural sense of resentment. And I think Moynihan and Herberg were right in pointing that out. It was told me several times the last time I was in Russia that the typical farmer there who sees his neighbor prospering doesn't ask himself as an American would, what shall I do to prosper along with him? He wants to find out how he can keep his neighbor from prospering. And so he becomes against whatever mechanisms or practices his neighbor uses. If that were an analogy, then it would be correct that in some concentrations of blacks in the urbans, surveying the success of their neighbors, they transform it into an ethnic dispute. Now, this is not really singularly anti-Semitic, it seems to me, given that the identical phenomenon happens if they're Koreans or Japanese or Hispanics. That is to say, the resentment is of whatever it is that the successful neighbor is engaging in, that they are not succeeding in. So that the anti-Semitism is purely adventitious rather than in any sense organic.
Yes, sir.
What are your reflections on the perpetuation of anti-Semitism in lands that are now virtually free of Jews, for example, Poland?
What is your explanation for the perpetuation of anti-Semitism in lands that are virtually free of Jews, such as in Poland?
I think it is everywhere a continuing problem. It is everywhere a continuing problem because there's always a search for demonology. People who have a hard time want to find somebody other than themselves to blame for that hard time. And the Jews are historic casualties of that search for victimization. What we have, however, working for us is a highly consolidated spiritual and Christian denunciation of that activity. For everyone who would engage in an explicit anti-Semitic utterance in Poland today, there would be 100 who would denounce him. So it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen, but it does suggest to me that the likelihood of its becoming public policy is pretty remote.
Yes, right here.
Disturbing figure was released to the American people. About 22% of America believes the Holocaust didn't happen. What is your take on Holocaust revisionism and its relationship to anti-Semitism?
This man asks that a figure was released that 22% of Americans believe that the Holocaust never happened, and asks Mr. Buckley what his response is to Holocaust revisionism.
It seems to me that not very much should be made of those figures. During 3 or 4 months last year, I ran into people I would really have thought of as rather intelligent and seasoned, who, having seen the movie about Kennedy, said, well, of course, we now know that, that it was a national conspiracy that resulted in the attribution of the guilt to Oswald. I actually paused with one lady who told me this and said, look, do you realize that if Oliver Stone is correct, we are committed to a conspiracy that involves the Supreme Court, the FBI, the Department of Justice, and 2 presidential administrations? To which you replied, well, if you want to put it that way. So I have no doubt that those 22% who disbelieve in the Holocaust are, so to speak, people on the street that USA Today picked up, bound on some idle peregrination. I haven't read a serious book doubting the Holocaust figures, let alone seen an Oliver Stone movie. So I think of it as a form of iconoclasm. If they say there was a Holocaust, I say it wasn't. And it's the up yours vote. I think it is absolutely without any ideological or creedal credentials.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Buckley, have you ever considered the following hypothesis, that it's not a question of education so much, or even background, that may lead to discrimination, anti-Semitism, or anti-black sentiments, but actually something having to do with the early childhood experiences of a particular individual, specifically that cruelty on the part of parents is reacted to by the child in such a way that those feelings towards a cruel parent are in fact directed to an alien group or another group.
Did everyone hear the question? It's kind of hard to repeat.
The answer is no.
I'd just like to end with a question of my own, Mr. Buckley. How can the Republican Party redirect itself to appear and become more inclusive to other groups in America?
Well, as I understand your question, you're asking me, why did Reagan lose Minnesota in 1984? When he lost Minnesota, I sent him a note and I said, here's an explanation for what happened. In 1956, Estes Kefauver upset Adlai Stevenson in Minnesota in the Democratic primary. Nobody could understand how this could happen. Somebody asked Professor Raymond Moley how it could happen, and he answered, did you ever try to tell a joke in Minneapolis? The Republican Party has had its downs recently. They coincided with an enormous dip in the economy. But when you consider that the President of the United States got fewer votes than Mr. Dukakis or Mr. Mongrave, that gives you a perspective which suggests that the Republican Party is not exactly isolated or forlorn. There are lots of things that I see the Republican Party do, and in my magazine and my column, I stress those. But I think it's premature to think of it as comatose. And certainly the president doesn't think of it as that. If the question is what specifically ought to be done, I encourage you to read my magazine.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.